Welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting for June 5th. We'd like to start today by describing something that happened many years ago. In 1999, the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche reflected on a proposal that he had put forward some 11 years earlier in 1988 as to how a United States president faced with economic catastrophe should act in his first days in office.
On my first day as president, I shall declare a national economic emergency and launch the largest economic recovery program in our history. During each of the first 2 years of my administration, about $2 trillion in low-cost federal loans will be invested in building up our nation's presently rotting industrial infrastructure, plus building up about 5 million new industrial jobs during the first 3 or 4 years of my administration. Looking back to the experience of the 1940-1943 period under President Franklin Roosevelt, we know that the recovery will creak at the beginning, but will build up speed over the first 2 years, so that about the third year, the United States will have the highest per capita income in our history. There are no mysterious tricks involved. It is all basic economics modeled upon our successful economic recoveries under Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. To use that kind of policy, a science driver policy, to accelerate economic growth and technological progress and productivity and employment and quality of employment in the United States, in Europe, and also to use the obsolescence-ridden industries of Poland, of Czechoslovakia, of Hungary, of Russia itself, the Soviet Union itself, to use the technological capabilities they had, despite their ruined, bankrupt industries, for massive infrastructure building throughout Eurasia, and on the foundations of that to build a general economic growth throughout this planet as a whole, in which we would participate with our former adversaries of the Warsaw Pact system in helping to develop countries in Asia which sought development, countries in Africa which desperately needed development, countries in South America, Central America, which desperately needed a reversal of the present trends in their policy. That was my policy. That was the policy thinking of some people.
That was also a policy that was not adopted. That 1999 occasion in which Lyndon LaRouche was speaking on that reflection of his earlier 1988 campaign was taken from his Storm Over Asia, in which he was warning at that time about a general disintegration in relations among transatlantic nations and the nations such as China and Russia of the Trans-Pacific. What we want to discuss today was we want to take up this concept of a science driver. And I should also note that the earliest clip from 1988 was from Lyndon LaRouche's The Woman on Mars, in which he had begun by describing a 40-year policy that he was putting forward at that time in 1988 for Moon-Mars colonization through the space program. So what we want to do today is we're going to begin with a discussion which will be between Jason Ross, who worked with Lyndon LaRouche and his science team, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and Dr. Calvin Kem. Diane Sayre, who's usually the co-host, will also be here a little bit later. And I just want to state a couple things about Jason first. The concept of the LaRouche basement team was something that occurred about 20 years ago, a little bit over 20 years ago, in which Lyndon LaRouche decided just after that Storm Over Asia clip to try to develop a young cadre of emerging scientists, people who would actually look at real physical science and would be able to take his earlier ideas of economics and really give them the real sort of physical scientific representation that he wanted to see. And so Jason was there from pretty much the inception of this project, and he's going to start us off today, and we'll follow him with Dr. Kem.
Okay, well, thank you, Dennis. What I'd like to take a chance to focus on today is Lyndon LaRouche's very bold claim that there are no limits to growth. And we're going to walk through why this is the case. We're going to take a look at claims 50 years ago that there were limits to growth and how right those claims were or weren't, and take a look at comparison about the claims about climate catastrophe that we're told are threatening us today. And we'll see how right those claims are. We'll also talk about what the goal has been behind making claims like this, which hasn't been to make the world a better place, and then talk about how to move forward. So the LaRouche organization has put out a report, The Great Leap Backward, LaRouche Crushes the Green New Deal, in which we go through what the lie is behind this climate stuff today. But let's take a look at what the human species has done. Okay, what characterizes our species? We've seen population growth unlike that achieved by any other form of life. Over a very short period of time, literally the blink of an eye in evolutionary time, we've seen changes in our population that could only be compared with something like the rise of the mammals, a new, higher form of life with higher energy density than the reptiles, higher energy use, characterized by a greater control over its own environment. The mammals took off over, millions of years. Look what we did in just a few thousand. We're absolutely unique as species. One way that we've done that is that we have transformed our relationship to nature. First, by having agriculture at all. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Instead of looking for plants to eat, you figure out how seeds work and you plant them yourself. Wow. Look in just the past 100 years, how much land is required per person for the food that we eat. It's down by a half. Phenomenal. And this is something that's taken place all around the world, in different regions of the world at different rates over the last 50, 60 years. But all around the world, less land is required per person. That's pretty phenomenal. Now, even though this is a great breakthrough, in the 1960s and then into the 1970s, a new social movement was created that said that human beings were a pox on the planet, that we were destroying nature, that we were an environmental catastrophe, that really we just shouldn't exist. And in 1972, a group called the Club of Rome published this book called The Limits to Growth. You see it on the left. On the right is Lyndon LaRouche's response, published not by the Club of Rome, but the Club of Life, entitled, There Are No Limits to Growth. So where does this idea of the limits to growth come from? It wasn't dreamed up in 1972. Okay, this goes back literally thousands of years, but the most recent modern example, would be Thomas Malthus. In 1798, he wrote that the power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man, food, that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. He says there isn't enough food. Here's the Club of Rome in 1972. If the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. I don't know if they had checked out Thomas Malthus's projection written 200 years earlier that said basically the same thing and was completely wrong. Maybe they just didn't know about it. So who else has this viewpoint? Well, one is Prince Philip, who recently passed away and I'm sure is enjoying his time in the afterlife where he can torment people. He had said, I wonder what it would be like to be reincarnated in an animal whose species had been so reduced in numbers that it was in danger of extinction. What would be its feelings towards the human species whose population explosion had denied it somewhere to exist? I must confess that I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus. Now, that view from Prince Philip, where he's worried about these poor animals mad about the human race, turn that around a little bit and look at it from the view of a species going extinct known as the oligarchy. The imperial world that has plagued mankind for possibly our entire existence, or certainly since civilization. How does that oligarchy view an increase in the well-being of common people? an increase in population, countries becoming stronger, more sovereign, able to make their own decisions about their resources, and less subject to the demands made by outsiders coming in to set up mines on their own, trade zones, etc. I think it's a pretty similar outlook. So, another example, David Attenborough. You thought he just narrated those nature films with that wonderful British voice of his about this magnificent creature in the deep. Here's what he says about people. The human population can no longer be allowed to grow in the same old, uncontrolled way. If we do not take charge of our population size, then nature will do it for us. So this was the outlook behind the limits to growth. Those are more modern quotes, but that's the outlook. People are bad. So the limits to growth, the way this book worked was they used computers, which were super amazing and hot at the time, amazing new things, and they printed out charts like this one. So the letters on the chart are what the computer created. The lines were drawn in with a marker, just to give a sense of what kind of level of technology we're talking about. And here's a figure I just sort of pulled at random from the book. Figure 12, chromium availability. So going from left to right, you can see their estimates for the chromium reserves. You can see that in the middle of the screen there. And, they said that over time, the chromium reserves are going to decrease because we're using it. Makes sense. The usage rate, that's these letter U. They make this curve here. We're going to use more and more chromium. Uh-oh, it's becoming more expensive because there's little of it left. Now we're not going to be able to use anymore. Now it's all gone. And so we will have reached the limits of growth. There is no more chromium. You're out of luck. Sorry. Well, let's take a look at 2020, because 2020 happened, okay? 50 years since that book was written. How correct were they? So take a look at where they think the reserves would be, about 25% down from their 1970 level. The usage rate gone up dramatically from 1970. Here's what it really looks like in 2020. So the reserves are higher than they were in 1970. The amount of chromium that's available in the ground is higher than in 1970. How could there be more chromium available now if we've been using it? And look at how we've been using it. The usage number for 2020, 44, it's literally off the chart. I mean, it would actually be about 2.5 charts tall. That's where that number would be. We're using chromium at a rate 10 times higher than they had predicted for 2020. So how could that happen? How is there more of this resource rather than less, despite the fact that we're using it at 10 times a higher rate than they had forecast? What's wrong with this book? Were they just wrong? Did they know they were wrong? Well, they take up a concept that is applied to animal life, and they try to apply it to human life, and it's called carrying capacity. They say that the population of some life form, rabbits or something, there's a certain limit to how many of them can live in an area, and the population might grow, but then it'll sort of reach a limit. But they acknowledge that the carrying capacity might not be fixed, that it could be changed. They say it could decrease. That by our consumption of resources, the carrying capacity, the number of people that can be supported on the planet, will decrease over time. Were they right? I'll let you think about that one. So let's take a look now at what they did with their, super powerful 1970s computers to make these charts that are totally cringe-worthy today. So here's one of them. They say, let's look at what will happen in the world. So you can see at the top, resources, we're going to be out of resources. By 2100, there will literally be 0 resources left. That's their projection. 0, okay? Nothing left. What else do they show happening? The population is going to reach a peak and then tumble down pretty rapidly. Food, we're not going to have enough food. We're not going to have any industrial output. There's going to be so much pollution. We're doomed. Human population has no hope. They realized they might have been a bit pessimistic. So they said, let's double natural resources so that that doesn't become an issue. Now look at what happens. Those dots, pollution. off the chart. Pollution will kill us, they say, by about, frankly, right around today. Pretty darn close. Did that happen? Let's say resources are unlimited, essentially. Well, still, we're going to run out of land, we're going to run out of food, and then look at the population fall off a cliff. We are doomed. You can't get away from it, they said. What if we created pollution control? Let's run the model one more time. Let's say we figure out a way to turn pollution into something useful. Well, we are still going to reach a problem with food production, and it's going to cause a population collapse. A little bit later, but it will still happen. They say, okay, what if we have unlimited resources? We have pollution controls, we make agricultural productivity improved, and we have perfect birth control. You can see this wackadoodle thing comes out of their crazy 1970s computer system, and they say that we're still doomed. So what's the conclusion that they make from all of this? Do they say, well, gee, every time we updated our model by having, improvement, things lasted well for longer, therefore, we should just keep updating our model. We should always have scientific progress. We should control pollution. We should improve agriculture. We should develop new resources. And then we will never reach limits to growth because the limits keep getting pushed back as we discover more. Is that what they said? No. They said because we're doomed eventually, we should start cutting back right now. We should have a limit to how well people can live. Too much consumption? Bad. Your lifestyle has to be limited. Small apartments for everybody, that's it, too bad. Speaking of people, that better be limited too. They said we have to control the number of people, keep it down. So LaRouche's response to this had been writing his book, There Are No Limits to Growth, where he described the reason that what they're sort of acknowledging with the fact that they have to keep remaking their model, but then they fail to acknowledge what they're explicitly keeping out of it. And that is human creativity. The fact that when we discover new principles of science, new forms of technology, we create new resources. That's why there's more chromium reserves today than in 1970. We create resources that simply were mineral deposits before. Think about the use of rare earth elements today. So important today for phones and batteries and motors and things like that. Hardly used 50 years ago. A new resource. Think about how we have continued to reduce the amount of land required per person for agriculture, despite increasing the quality of agriculture overall. More people eating meat, for example, which overall takes more land than eating, potatoes. So what made this all possible was an increasing density of power in human society. One way to look at this is with the literal amount of power per pound of fuel. So here you can see a comparison of a ton of wood has as much heat potential as 500 pounds of coal, which is the same as 340 pounds of oil, so still getting better, which is the same as 0.0002 pounds of uranium. It's not drawn to scale. If it were, it wouldn't even be a pixel. That's how small it is. Why does so little uranium provide so much more energy than a truckload of wood, multiple truckloads of wood, a forest load of wood? Why is that possible? What's the difference in the type of transformations that uranium undergoes compared to natural gas? So because of that intensity, people sometimes say, well, renewables, they don't use any pounds of fuel. There's no uranium, there's no wood, there's no coal. Well, there's still the power plant itself. So if you look at the amount of tons of material required to make energy, just look at that. Compare solar panels to a nuclear plant. The solar panels don't require fuel in the sense of something that you put in every year, but if you consider the entire panel itself a form of fuel that slowly gets used up over 30 years, it's way more material intense. So why do we have these limits? Why haven't we expanded the use of nuclear power? Let's take a look at a chart that was made back in the 1970s about efforts to achieve nuclear fusion. This is a bit of a complex chart. So what it represents is different years that were estimated that we'd be able to reach nuclear fusion, the process that occurs in the sun, and be able to use it for our own economy, to create new resources, to desalinate ocean water, plenty of water in the oceans. They said if we spent a lot, we could get it by 93. If we don't spend so much, we'll get it by 2005. This brownish magenta line, that was the 1978 level of funding. They said, you know what, we're never really going to get there. We'll do little experiments, but we're never going to get there. The black line is actual U.S. government commitments to fusion research. If you want to talk about creating a new form of power on this planet to supplant coal, which I agree we should do, petroleum, for example, better to use it for plastics, for clothing. You know, most of the clothing that the North Face sells, this is a very environmentally friendly company, just to take an example. They talk about their environmental bona fides. Well, most of their clothing products are made with petroleum. Did you know that? That's where nylon comes from. That's where plastics come from. Polyester. These come from petroleum. So instead of burning it, we should save it to make things. Totally agree. So just to put into perspective what our priorities have been, take a look here. This is the average annual funding that would have been required to achieve fusion. You know, a few $billion a year. Compare that to the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb. Compare that to the enormous spending of the Apollo program. So, expensive. Fusion program would be expensive. The total funding for a fusion crash program would be somewhere in between the Manhattan Project and going to the moon. Okay? Let's compare this to our spending on renewables. To adjust the chart a little bit, that was how much money went into renewables, so-called renewables, in 2018. So where are our priorities if we're saying that we've got this problem, we need to find new forms of energy, and then we're throwing away money into ineffective, intermittent, unreliable forms of power like solar panels or windmills, which were great 500 years ago. They're not really a very good idea anymore. Where are our priorities? So the limits to growth is a joke, and it's coming up again today in a very similar way. Computer models, which will look even more cringe-worthy in 50 years as their projections are invalidated, are being used to terrify people into worrying about a climate catastrophe, and people are told that they must take immediate, urgent steps to avert this catastrophe. The models have been around long enough that we can see how well they've done. So here you see estimates made by climate models in the past of what they thought would happen with the temperature. This is a bit of an out-of-date chart. You can see it kind of ends around 2015, but compared with what the actual temperature was, it stopped growing. But people cry that the sky is falling. Here's Mustafa Talba, the executive director of the UN Environmental Program. He warned, the world faces an ecological disaster as final as nuclear war unless governments act now. Without action, the future will bring, by the turn of the century, an environmental catastrophe which will witness devastation as complete, as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust. I don't know if you heard that statement. It was made in May of 1982. Did that happen? Here's Noel Brown, the New York director of the UN Environmental Program. This is some reporting on what he said. A senior UN environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed within 12 years. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos. 1989. Stop playing the Guess the Year game. The chief of the UN's International Panel on Climate Change, 2007. If there's no action before 2012, that is too late. What we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine our future. How about Prince Charles? He's really in touch with the common people. Look at him hanging out on his lazy boy watching TV. March 2009. We have less than 100 months to alter our behavior before we risk catastrophic climate change. We have 100 months to act. Those 100 months have passed. We have 7 years, he says in 2009. 86 months, he says in 2010. 2014, we are running out of time. How many times have I found myself saying this over the recent years? How about this young lady? Okay, so, we've been treated to this, scowling young lady lecturing us about how terrible it is to think about economic growth and having fun or being happy. Let's take a quick talk. I know I'm going on for a while here, about these climate models and what they're missing. So earlier we talked about the limits to growth and how LaRouche identified what was deliberately left out of this book on purpose, namely human creativity. In other words, they were writing a book not about human civilization, but about any civilization that stopped progressing and showed why it would be doomed. So let's take a look at these climate models and where they come from. So the very same chart of temperatures in the United States was published using the same data, okay, in 1999 and then in 2006. If we look at what the temperature change was from this, we can see this peak in the 1930s to what it was in 1999, the reporting of the data changed. In 1999, NASA, NOAA said, oh, it went down 0.6 degrees. In 2006, they said, no, it actually increased over that same time period. The past changed. The IPCC in 1990 acknowledged that there was a medieval warm period centered around 1200 AD, where temperatures in Europe were significantly warmer. This occurred around the world, followed by a little ice age, in which rivers froze that usually didn't, harvests were impacted. Compare that same time series as presented in the 2001 IPCC report. Now, the temperature is basically constant, but with industrialization, it takes off. These data aren't actually accurate, but like the earlier limits to growth, they're ignoring something very important, which is that our planet does not exist only in a solar system, but in a galaxy in which there are stars exploding, being formed, supernovas, a lot going on. What's the relationship? Well, if we take a look over the very, I'm going to skip this one, it's too much. This is about the change in the Earth's orbital eccentricity here and the climate. Let's take a look at something much simpler. The relationship between cosmic radiation, in red, and in blue, the level of cloud formation. There's a connection between clouds and cosmic radiation coming from beyond our solar system and impacting our Earth significantly. If we take a look at relationships between temperature and cosmic rays, we see something very compelling. Far more compelling, in fact, than carbon dioxide changes in the atmosphere. Much of this work has been done by Jasper Kirkby and by Henrik Svensmark in Denmark. What they look at is how it is that cosmic radiation is able to cause the formation of what are called cloud condensation nuclei, where you can have water vapor in the air, but it doesn't necessarily turn into a cloud. Now, what do clouds do? They're white. You can see them. They reflect light. More clouds, less heat from the sun. Cosmic radiation can create condensation nuclei. This has been seen observationally and through an experiment at CERN, the European Center for Nuclear Research, where man-made cosmic rays, the equivalent of cosmic rays, were created and used to create cloud condensation nuclei. So there's something major involved in determining our climate that these models simply leave out, that Greta Thunberg doesn't, look at when she's yelling and scolding people. The last thing I want to point out is the enormous cost of these supposed save the planet things, of CO2 reduction. First off, we should be very happy about our increase in CO2. Take a look here at the amount of CO2 emitted per person and life expectancy. Each dot is a country. Emitting CO2 on its own doesn't make you live longer. If you go down and, if you go burn down a building, that doesn't mean you're going to live to 150. But on a societal level, the energy made available by fossil fuels has tremendously expanded our life expectancy. The amount of energy available to us in the form of electricity, look at how that relates to a reduction in infant mortality. Energy is an essential component of the infrastructure needed to have higher living standards. When we look at the unequal and really devastating inequalities in development across the planet, where you can see some areas are just inhospitable, so maybe there's less development there, but that really isn't the full story at all. Take a look at the difference between North and South Korea, if you can pick them out. Take a look at what's right in the middle of the screen. Take a look at Africa. Where's the light? This is satellite pictures of the Earth at night. Where's the light? For African nations to become developed, what will supply the power for this? It's not going to be windmills. So there's a specific criterion Lyndon LaRouche points to on what it takes to power an economy, and this is what I'm going to wrap up with. He wrote that, in general, the potential productivity of an economy is limited on the higher side by the energy density of the basic modes of energy production being used by that economy. The higher the energy density, the cheaper the energy can be in terms of social costs of producing energy, and the more abundant the energy available for expanding the economy. Cheaper the energy can be in terms of social costs of producing energy. This isn't about subsidies and getting paid to put solar panels on your roof. What does it take for us as a society to produce the needed energy? Okay, he continues, the step-by-step advance from a full-scale fission energy economy, our current form of nuclear power, into a fusion energy economy, what powers the sun, this is the unique path of development which enables our nation and the world to increase the effective rate of capital formation into the next century and beyond. It is the only policy which leads to this successful survival of our civilization. So the only thing that allows us to live indefinitely into the future, the only kind of growth that is sustainable, is not slow growth or degrowth. It's accelerating growth, characterized by higher energy densities of the power made available to us. So the physical energy of wind blowing through a turbine, extremely low. The power of the atomic nucleus, of rearranging a nucleus, of interactions among nuclei, a million times more energetic than chemical reactions like coal or natural gas. This is the key to unlocking what will completely transform our idea of resources in a way that you could really only compare it to the advent of the steam engine, which allowed us to turn fuels into motion, making it possible to create labor performed by rocks. A transformation beyond that is what we have in front of us. And the way to make that happen is not going to be by building windmills, solar panels, and saying, oh, we're terrible sinners for destroying the earth. It's to recognize that we have a unique capability to create resources where they did not exist before, and to the extent that CO2 affects the climate, which I'm sure it does, to be able to deal easily with whatever changes it brings about, which we've already done. I mean, deaths due to extreme weather are down to 1 or 2% what they were a century or two ago. Not because the weather changed, but because we're more resilient. We're able to create our own environments and improve our own environments increasingly in a way that gives us an independence that is not achieved by the animals, which are just out there hit by whatever comes their way. We're in control of our environment. We create a synthetic, nurturing environment for ourselves, and improving the quality of that, that's the way to move forward.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jason. And by the way, I didn't think your presentation was too long at all. I think it was exactly the kind of thing that people needed. We're going to now hear from Dr. Calvin Kem, South African nuclear physicist for the Nuclear Energy Company of South Africa, and currently an associate with Strategic Business Strategy Consultants. Dr. Kem has been with us a few times, and because of the response that people had to you the last time you were here, Doc, we wanted to bring you back and certainly wanted to hear what you have to say, especially as we are going to, in about 3 weeks, be doing a conference, which I'll discuss after you speak and after Diane is on with us. So you now have the floor.
Thank you, Dennis. It's nice to see you folks again. Energy is the lifeblood of a society. Without it flowing around the system will just stop. There's no argument about that. If you look back historically a number of decades, you'll find that the total electricity consumption of the planet has doubled in about the last 25 to 30 years. Doubled. That's not long ago, 25 to 30 years ago. There's absolutely no reason to think that it's not going to double over the next 25 to 30 years. Stories that you hear of us having to cut back on energy consumption to save the planet and so on, I just do not believe that. In fact, I think that energy consumption is going to double a lot faster than the next 25 years. It'll be shorter. If one looks at a number of African countries as well, one would expect them to double even faster. There are numbers of African countries where they are only 20% electrified, some as low as 15 or even less. The only honorable thing that their leaders can do right now in terms of energy is to go for 100% increase, then 100% increase again and again and again. That will increase the level of sophistication of their society and lead to a better quality of life. We saw a few moments ago with Jason indicating CO2 output linked to life expectancy and general health and welfare of people in general. I believe that's undoubtedly the case. There are no limits to growth, I believe. There's a fallacy, and it's quite easy to understand how some people come to that conclusion. We certainly can't be telling countries like Africa, it's not only Africa, the same would be true of South American countries and many other countries in the world. But when I say Africa, I mean generically many others that are in a similar position. I'm in South Africa, where we have some 85% of the country electrified, and it's a very sophisticated country in comparison to much of the rest of Africa. So we cannot go around telling other people to cut back on energy consumption, to cut back on electrification and so on, because somebody else tells them to. Now, if you look at Thomas Malthus back in 1798, and you say, what must have been going through his mind? I think that what must have been happening at the time is that he didn't have an understanding of the way science could change society. He must have looked at transport and said, how many more wagons can we build with the wood available and the limited iron that they had to make nails and wheel rims and things like that? He must have said, how much more wood can we burn? And fires, coal hadn't come about then as a major factor. He must have looked at food and bearing in mind the very unscientific way in which food was cultivated in those days without fertilizers and machinery and the ability to plow. Incidentally, the British unit of measure, the acre, is how much one man can plow in one day. They use 22 yards, the length of a cricket pitch as the length along one side, and then the plow zigzag backwards and forwards, and whatever a man could plow in one day, that is how the acre was defined. So a 10-acre plot, for example, would be something that a man would take 10 days to plow. But clearly, if you've got one man and one ox and one wooden plow, there is a limit to just how much he can plow before he's got to stop and plant and so on. So it's not unsurprising to realize that Malthus probably came to those conclusions without taking the advantage of science and society into account. He didn't know about plastics. He could never have conceived of integrated circuit chips leading to computerization. He couldn't have conceived of stainless steel, telephone links, and all that type of thing, which changed the way one looked at society. So now you say to yourself, too, that you can say, all right, Thomas Malthus couldn't imagine that. He didn't have the foresight to realize how much science would change society. But then we saw David Attenborough earlier, so worrying about the population growth and using the unfortunate term in this uncontrolled way. Immediately a shiver has to go down one's spine and say, who's going to do the controlling? Who's going to do the controlling? Him and his people, or who's going to do the controlling? Clearly, population is not going to grow and grow and grow forever. It will be controlled. And how population is controlled, it's a self-control. It's a self-feedback mechanism. When your children are going to live because you have a hospital that has got an electrical supply and you've got sophisticated medicine, you don't have to have 15 children as an insurance policy for your old age. We've seen that in many countries in the world. The size of families become self-limiting when you've got to take into account education that's got to be paid for and a whole lot of things, and not just surviving from hand to mouth on a day-to-day basis. So we have to look and say, what exactly do we see in the future? Already nuclear has been mentioned, but a piece of uranium metal, less than the size of a cold drink can, will supply enough electricity for the entire lifetime of one person. That is not the case with coal or wood or something. If you want to look at how much coal is required for one person's lifetime, it's a mound a lot bigger than somebody's house by far. So the whole nature of what is going to be required to supply a society will be different. Small amounts of uranium in relatively small buildings in comparison to the sizes that have to be used now. So we're in the same type of position as Malthus. We must just be a lot smarter. Society 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years from now is not going to be remotely like ours is today. They're going to look back 200 years, just like we look back some 200 years now to Malthus and say, gee, he was blind to all the things that were going to occur. 200 years, they're going to look back and say, good heavens, those people in the year 2020, 21, and so on, never realized we were going to do that and that and that. So we must have faith in the ingenuity of the people that will come in the future. And so the limits to growth will be self-limiting factors that come into play due to the fact that science will become the driver of society. It's a driver of society now. And unfortunately, many people are not recognizing that sufficiently, but it is the driver of society. So it's time we recognize that more fully. So just last point I want to make at this stage is we see a change in the nature of politics, which is concerning me somewhat. And this links now to Attenborough's use of the word control, or uncontrolled, he said. Uncontrolled manner, implying we have to control. You say to yourself, we can't allow there to be more and more control from governments around the world in the belief that they are somehow good for us. You know, we see the concept of democracy, which is great. Democracy says you mustn't have dictatorships and such like. But now what we're seeing is a case of, in some instances, the more power to the people concept almost going a bit too far. Because what I see is that people, more and more people are able to have more and more of an opinion faster due to internet, email connections, and this type of thing. So if some incident occurs, many people find out fast, many people can get pleased, upset, and whatever the case might be, and react. So all of a sudden, there's a popular perception, a popular image, a popular vote, a popular reaction, which quite frequently is based a lot more on emotion and a lot less on good sense in the decision making. people start to vote with their hearts, which is understandable. You hear that somebody is suffering and there's an instinct to say, let's go and help them. And so, well, there's an obstacle in the way. Well, let's collectively get rid of the obstacle. And so you vote with your heart, not saying, but maybe the thing that you see as the obstacle is something we need. We need a bit more thought on this. So you see, for example, the energy situation now with the wind and solar. There's this hot type feeling that coal is bad, therefore let's get rid of coal. Very few people sit down and do the maths, the calculations, to say what happens if we try and get rid of coal and we don't use nuclear and we go to wind and solar only. It's just not working. I've got no problem with people using wind and solar in certain circumstances where it's applicable. There are places where it's applicable, but not trying to drive an electric locomotive for 1,000 kilometers. You don't connect that to wind and solar. There's no solar at night, and the wind can drop at any moment. It's just far too risky. Then we see, where has this type of thinking been most prevalent? And from our perspective, where I sit here in the bottom part of Africa, we see a lot of influence coming from Germany. Recently, Chancellor Angela Merkel stepped down after a prestigious run in office. But during her entire term of office, she never had more than about 1/3 of the popular vote, which is quite amazing. And so what happened was she stayed in power as a result of a coalition government where the Green Party had a significant swing vote, even though they were a very minor party of never more than 10%. They still had a swing vote. So then you see Germany go into this major energy transition thing of theirs with wind and solar to a great degree, which to my mind is not working there, no matter what anybody says, because soon have you got going with that, then you need batteries to smooth it out. Now you've got to go for a big hydrogen thing. The hydrogen is because the wind is not reliable enough. So you've got to take excess wind energy when the wind is blowing hard and push it into some storage mechanism, which is the hydrogen, so you can recover it when the wind isn't blowing and it's nighttime and there's no solar, and so on. So you're just getting complexity upon complexity upon complexity. And you say, why has that come about? Has it come about because they used really sound engineering and used science as the driver for their economy? Or did it come about as an emotional response because the government was never more than 1/3 of the population supporting the governing party of Merkel, and that people like the Green Party had an unreasonable swing vote? I've heard reliable personal opinions coming my way from Germany that it looks highly likely that they're going to have a Green chancellor in the future, immediate future, because of the swing vote thing, and that's the way the politics is going to pan out. So you have to say to yourself, isn't it dangerous to be making decisions on something as significant as the energy system of the country when it's a heartfelt knee-jerk reaction that is making the decision and not the sound scientific driver? And finally, what I'd like to say is what's even worse, harking back to what Attenborough said about this uncontrolled, when we find that those decisions in countries in Europe and elsewhere are now being used to tell countries in Africa how we have to develop, because the voters in some other country have got a swing vote, and therefore we are being forced to go into, say, wind and solar and so on, because we've been told that's the honorable, that's the moral, that's the so-and-so way to go. For me, the honorable and way to go and the moral way to go is let all children in Africa get into clinics, be able to have hospitalization, have education, have communications like cell phone technology and so on, and have all the modern facilities that will naturally lead to control, in the sense that it will be self-limiting on family sizes and so on and so forth. That's the way we have to do it. And so science must be the driver of society, and we must take a little bit of time to sit down and very carefully think through it and to come to sound answers, and not answers as a result of a demonstration in the street with people waving placards. We need sense and science to rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kem. And if you've just joined us, today's Manhattan Project meeting is devoted to a discussion of how technological science drivers are the real basis for a realistic future for humanity, not the Great Reset or the Green New Deal. I've been joined by Diane Sayer, who is an independent candidate for the United States Senate, running against Chuck Schumer in 2022. Just want to take the moment to just ask whether Jason may have anything to say in response to what Dr. Kem had to say, and then we'll ask Diane if she has something as well. Jason?
I'm happy to just kind of let the discussion move forward, but thank you for asking.
Sure, great, fine. So Diane, you just sort of walked into all of this, so I don't know if you have anything to say or not.
Well, I have been listening, and I must say that I really appreciate taking a scientific, measurable approach to these matters. I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Kem that, part of this control of the social media and the news media is that people go into all kinds of things. We have trial by press, people who did not spend years and years of their life studying organic chemistry or going to medical school profess to be experts on how to cure diseases. It's very arbitrary, and I think it's quite a relief when people actually can see evidence and can have confidence in cause and effect. And I don't think people are opposed to it, but they have so little opportunity to actually engage or be involved in critical thinking that I think people might be quite happy to discover that indeed human beings are not destroying the planet, but actually perhaps they could develop another hypothesis that human beings are helping to develop the universe.
Okay. So we're about to go into our discussion, and we do have Julian Fell, who's a biologist, who's with us today, and we'll be going to him in just a moment. We have put at the bottom of our screen questions@LaRoucheOrganization.com if you've got questions. But I think we also have a little 5-minute message that was sent to us from John Shanahan. John Shanahan is a civil engineer. He's the editor of allabout.energy.net and had a message for today's assembly. So if we can play that.
Hello, Dr. Kem. This is John Shanahan in Denver. We've been working together for the last 10 years or so to promote understanding of nuclear energy, fossil fuel energy, and the issue of carbon dioxide. It's been a most productive journey where my organization, the website allabout.energy.net, has gained tremendously from the leaders, science leaders and energy leaders in South Africa. The members in South Africa are exceptional in their expressing their understanding about energy. The thing that has been most important for me is to see that you, Dr. Kem, are a person that knows the science and works at several levels to communicate the importance of fossil fuel and nuclear energy, to communicate it to leaders in South Africa. And your own website called Nuclear Africa is working to introduce nuclear energy and nuclear medicine and nuclear science to all the countries in Africa. You've done a wonderful job of that. And now we have organized this letter to the Nuclear Energy Institute. That's nominally to the Nuclear Energy Institute. It's going to go to many energy organizations, and it's going to go to leaders in government in many countries. And you have put together this very detailed letter, and it has been reviewed by people around the world. And Douglas Lightfoot in Canada, a mechanical engineer who is a co-signer on the letter, said that you did a tremendous job in explaining our message to the Nuclear Energy Institute. So our job is to present this in a very simple way to people who will be co-signers. People who are going to be co-signers are people that agree with your message, but don't necessarily understand most of it. But when we get, our goal is to get information to many people around the world that carbon dioxide is the essential for the food chain, essential for human beings, absolutely essential. There is no way scientifically that it is a pollutant. Secondly, to get a message to everybody that they really need fossil fuels and their byproducts. Fossil fuels and their byproducts made the modern world today what it is. And then nuclear power can provide tremendous amounts of energy and radioisotopes for nuclear medicine science. So we want to present that in a simple way and to people along with the letter that you wrote, and collect very large numbers of co-signers. And on the website to co-sign it, we have a drop-down list of a role for who this each one person, what role they play. And there are 3 roles for students, high school students, college students, and grad students. Then another role is parents, because many people are parents and they're concerned about their children in the future, and these 3 questions are very important. And then we go down into the various professions that they can choose, and also political leaders. And finally, another collective role is retired, and people that don't want to say anything more than that, and they happen to be retired. And finally, the other catch-all is simply a role called other. Anyway, what we're trying to do with that is get people to say, hey, I'm a parent, or I'm a high school student, and I want to sign it. And our mission is to get that, reach out and get a lot of people to sign. We want to get people from South Africa to sign, because they have such excellent leadership in yourself and your colleagues. We have good contacts in India, and we want to get them to encourage a lot of the most likely people to sign. Dr. Kem, the time between now and when we are going to release this letter, July 19th, Monday, July 19th, is a time to try to reach out to as many people, and we will look for guidance from the Schiller Institute, from yourself, from your organization, Nuclear Africa. We are fully behind you and the Schiller Institute, and want to make this effort and your general missions as successful as possible. We'll be glad to help in any way we can.
Now, Dr. Kem, I want to ask you about one element of this, which is that you, in the letter, make a very specific point about why it is essentially scientifically wrong and also immoral to try to promote nuclear power on the basis that it stops global warming. Could you say something about that?
Yes, I can. However, just before I say that, I would like to just thank Dr. Shanahan for those incredibly kind words. If there's anybody that needs huge applause, it's him. the effort that he's put into spreading information around the world for the last decade plus is absolutely unbelievable. So he's done an absolutely wonderful job, and he certainly hasn't stopping. He's carrying on. And I marvel at what effort he puts into promoting good sound science and good sensible thinking. As far as the carbon dioxide story is concerned, what we've seen in the last 150 years, which is about the time of the Crimean War, incidentally, the time of Abraham Lincoln, and which the anti-nuclear people always say, since the industrial age, as if that implies that the industrial age is to blame. It's not. So I would rather not do that. Let's say since the Crimean War, just for any date. Pick any date you like, and you can find that there's numbers of incidents in history that you can link. So there, from about the time of the Crimean War till now, the amount of carbon dioxide in the air has gone up and down. During that same time, the temperature has gone up and down. All right? The CO2 has continued to rise. Maybe I said up and down just now. I made a mistake. The CO2 has continued to rise steadily since then, from 0.03% of the atmosphere to 0.04% of the atmosphere. The temperature has not gone along with it. There has been a general increase in temperature to some degree, about 1 degree, since the time of the Crimean War. Now imagine in your mind how far back that was. And it's only 1 degree that has gone up Celsius. So there's this tiny change in temperature, which has not been continuous all of the time, but that the carbon dioxide has. Then this term, since the industrial age, is permanently used as if it's automatic that the industrial age caused it. There's no indication of that. Yes, there has been an increase in carbon dioxide. Clearly, industrialization has led to some of it, but it's actually a rather small percentage, very small percentage, in fact. And if you look at what has happened, by far the biggest part of that CO2 contribution is from nature, from natural occurrences going on. If you look back, Jason Ross showed a picture, a diagram of the temperatures showing the medieval warm period and then going into what's called the Little Ice Age, a graph in comparison to the false hockey stick graph. That one showing the medieval warm period, that medieval warm period was warmer than now. There you can see it at year 1200. It was warmer than now. There was no industrial CO2 to blame in the year 1200. When we dived into the Little Ice Age during the time of Shakespeare, the Thames froze over to such a degree you could ride carriages, horse-drawn carriages down the Thames. It was that solid, the ice. They had ice fairs on the ice. Many people going in tents and having dancing and so on and so forth on the ice. During the Little Ice Age, that was a time of disease. It was a time of crop failures. After that period, what was induced was like the Pilgrim Fathers going to the United States. I'm not claiming directly as a result of that. There was also the early settlers that came permanently to South Africa in 1652, at a similar time to the Pilgrim Fathers going to the US. Now, I sincerely believe that it's likely that the harsh times that had been the case in Europe during the Little Ice Age were driving people to go and see where else they could settle in the world because of the starvation and crop failures and so on during the ice times. Now we're going into another warm period. You will find that if you look at the magnetic variations of the sun, there's a much greater scientific correlation between the magnetic variations of the sun and the warm periods and the cold periods, and it is not easily correlated to industrial carbon dioxide. This claim that the extremists make, saying the science is settled, it isn't. And if there's anything that's settled, it's certainly not that human carbon dioxide that has been produced from industrial activities is the main driver of the little bit of global warming that we've seen. And even if there is some global warming, the 1 degree since about the time of the Crimean War, why should that global warming lead to bad consequences? If you flip a coin 100 times, you'll get about 50 heads and you'll get about 50 tails. Why should it be that the effects of a changing climate should be different? Why is it that it is always claimed that if the global warming occurs, and there's a bit more of it, which this possibly will be, but looks like we're going into a cooling phase potentially. But if there is some more warming, why should it be that dry areas get drier, wet areas get wetter? Why shouldn't it be that dry areas get wetter and wet areas dry out? But for some reason, people always want to predict the worst consequences that could come out of it. Nobody says, global warming could be rather nice. Like at the end of the Shakespearean period, when the global warming started to occur then, after the Little Ice Age, everybody said, great. Traditionally, or if you look back in history to the Roman warming, the Minoan warming, and so on, you'll find that the warm periods were associated with health, welfare, and human prosperity. It was the cold periods which are the ones that are not good for the health and welfare of humanity. So what we find now is an obsession with trying to get rid of this CO2 and the belief that it is the big ogre. It's not. In fact, CO2, as Dr. Shanahan pointed out, is required by plants. There's experiments been done, absolutely conclusive, that more CO2 on crops and on vegetation causes growth. We've detected it in the last few years, a more greening of the planet as a result of the CO2 increase. If you want better crops and you want, as a result of that, better fed animals and so on, what you need is more CO2. The Earth is probably right now CO2 deprived in comparison to what it's been like in the past. In all likelihood, if we put a lot more CO2 into the atmosphere now, we'll all be a lot better off. So, firstly, the CO2 that's produced by the industrial activities, I do not believe is the problem. It is not reasonable for European countries and others to tell African countries they are not allowed to economically advance because our CO2 is going to make life difficult for them. It's completely unfair. Then we come to nuclear power. Nuclear power has been, as far as I'm aware now, been defined in the European Union as environmentally friendly or green from the point of view that it doesn't produce CO2. That's great. I'm happy with that. It doesn't produce CO2. But you then say, well, so what? Some people have been saying the non-production of CO2 by nuclear means that nuclear is good for the environment from the point of view of global warming. That is not the case. The CO2 has got nothing to do with it. The moment CO2 is a political reality in much of the world, and unfortunately you have to go with that. But nuclear power is just very good on its own merits. Sadly, I believe what is happening is a number of extreme elements in the world are opposed to a large source of electricity because they believe it will allow people to make more motor cars, it'll allow people to make more air conditioners, it'll allow more advanced lifestyle, which they believe is bad. So what that translates to is telling people in Africa that you may not advance. Stay living in your mud hut, stay living in your grass shack. You may not advance, and the way to stop advancement is stop the easy access to electricity. Now, nuclear promises to give large amounts of electricity from a central point easily. And now people say, oh dear, we can't blame the CO2 on nuclear anymore. So what are we going to do? Then they come up with nuclear waste and a number of other things and make them out to be problems. But undoubtedly, nuclear is a really good energy source. Right now, what we need is coal, clean burning coal, as clean as possible so that you do not emit sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides and so on. The CO2 is not an issue. You need coal because there's a lot of coal and it's a mainstay of the world. And you need nuclear. I believe as time goes by, the coal will decrease, not because of political pressure, but people will find that you can use nuclear power to take the coal and turn those valuable molecules into something else, which we do in South Africa. We have a process here called the Sasol process. We convert coal into petrol for motor cars, but we also convert coal into things like lipstick, waxes, aspirin, and a whole lot of other things come from taking those valuable molecules in the coal and chemically recombining them into something else. Why burn it? It's like burning dollar notes to make a fire. Rather go and pay for electricity to make a fire, to make the heat from an electrical fire and not a wood fire that you're throwing banknotes into. So I feel that it's really necessary now for science to be the driver, for people to say, what is reality? What is true here? And not listen to the chanting crowds in the street, so to speak, who might be going there with all the best will in the world and their hearts in the right place, but they do not understand enough of the science stuff, and you should not be making decisions by demonstrations in the street or people like Greta Thunberg sitting in Sweden, a sophisticated country, telling people living in Africa, go and mine the cobalt with your bare hands and so on, because we're being told to. Because as Attenborough says, we can't allow this type of uncontrolled. No, there mustn't be other people telling us what we can't do for our own benefit. Everybody be responsible, use your brains, use good sense with science as the driver. Thank you.
Jason, who has some reflections and a response to you, and then we go to Dr. Julian Fell, and then we'll come back to Diane, who at that point either will have some questions or may have some comments of her own. So, Jason?
One aspect, just thinking back to what you had said in your presentation, Dr. Cameron, what you just brought up was about the difficulty about this term science, which is so misused and abused, and people do terrible things to this this word and this concept about following science, and the scientists say this, and everybody needs to trust science. The thing is, how many people feel competent on their own to come to assessments on any of these things? I mean, they say at the same time that even a child can know that global warming is a problem, or even a child can understand the greenhouse effect or climate change. That's not true. I mean, look, really, you got people, how well do school children in the US coming out of high school, let's say, really understand, chemistry or physics? Is there like a great mastery of this to that, and which is far below what's required to even try to opine on a model about how the entire planet operates? I mean, this is extremely, extremely, extremely complex. And what happens is an odd message where it's both supposedly a very simple thing to understand, but at the same time, something that is essentially driven through an appeal to authority, where they say, look, 97% or 94% or 96, whatever, some percent of scientists all agree with blank. Therefore, that's what scientists think. Therefore, you should too. And I think what makes it really difficult is that, obviously culturally, it's not like people, hang out with their friends to, recreate measurements of the size of the Earth or do basic electromagnetic experiments. That's not a common way people spend their free time. But even in school, that's not what the kids do. So you get, you have years and years, you have a decade in school as a young person, right? This is a huge opportunity to recreate discoveries, to go through and know for yourself whether something that you're being taught is true or not, particularly if it's in, science or math, where you can test it out. History is maybe a little bit of a more difficult subject, but in a physics class, if you're teaching kids formulas and then they apply them to problems and then you tell them on a test whether they're right or not, you never know if that's actually relevant to the real world. Where are the labs? Where are the experiments? Where is recreating a concept and making it necessary, making it your own? Where is the ability to ask questions about these things and come to conclusions? Increasingly, it's being difficult to question a number of things in schools. I mean, the advent or the increasing pressure, certainly in the United States, towards critical race theory, towards a lot of, identity type stuff, makes it difficult to have conversations on many subjects. And I don't think that that's exactly helpful at addressing what really needs to be done, which is to, really recreate experiments to develop knowledge and feel competent yourself in actually arriving at conclusions. So, I mean, we've made assertions or claims on this show here. I mean, I happen to agree with them. I wouldn't have said them. And, I agree with what Dr. Kem and Shanahan had said. But I think that it's one of the biggest breakthroughs that I think people need to make is the willingness to say, hey, maybe I better figure this out for myself. And it's a huge and extremely difficult concept. I mean, to come to a conclusion about climate change, et cetera, I mean, that's going to take some hours. You're going to have to devote personally a significant amount of time into looking into this to really come out with something that you could consider reliably your own thoughts on it. One other aspect of this on the science is the bizarrely religious character that these claims take. Dr. Kem had mentioned about how instead of considering is it actually bad if the Earth gets a little bit warmer, it's just declared simply a catastrophe by virtue of its being different. So there's this axiom sneaking in that I think people are tacitly agreeing with, and maybe they don't realize that it's been snuck into their minds, which is that change is bad, that nature, I fear what nature means, basically not people, there's something just perfect and pure and pristine and ideal about it, and that any change to it would necessarily become worse. If we upset the balance of nature, we will have more typhoons, hurricanes, bad weather, freezing of crops, scorching heat and droughts in the summer. Just if it's bad, that's what'll happen because you upset nature by changing something. And that's an axiom that has to be absolutely rejected. There is nothing good about nature just by virtue of its being in a certain state, right? We take deserts and we bring in water. That's an improvement. Now you can grow food. It's a lot better than sand, right? We enjoy the produce, the agricultural produce of California. A lot of that's from deserts. That's a great thing that we brought in water and made that land more productive. So a change in itself is only bad if you adopt the axiom that we should not exist. And that's really the sort of religious-like belief that underlies a lot of this. That we as a species are both told that we shouldn't think of ourselves as better than, giraffes or something. But at the same time, we're told that we have a special responsibility. Do salamanders care about the well-being of crickets? Do pandas have a heartfelt concern for lemurs? No. Right? Do lions have a concern for the, whatever they're eating? No, of course not. But we're told that we have to care about all these other species, and at the same time that we're no different from them and shouldn't put ourselves on a higher pedestal, and that we should endeavor not to exist. That's essentially the goal that's being given and taught to kids and pushed in society overall. That's a terrible goal. I think we should exist, and we should do great things.
Okay, so Julian Fell is with us, is a marine biologist, biologist, excuse me. But also, I understand you've held regional office up in British Columbia and been working on these matters for a while. So go right ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're very clear.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah. There's very little been said here that I could disagree with. This is one of the best presentations I've seen on this subject in years. You've covered just about everything that my own research leads to. The comments I can bring is I can confirm from my time in public office that, because I attended conventions, so sometimes of up to 2,000 local government elected officials, that there is a great deal of suspicion. Maybe 40% of government elected people have a suspicion there's something not right about this global warming claims, but they can't put their finger on it. We're basically ruled by technological morons at the moment. I mean, you look at Greta Thunberg and that AOC congressperson and the current inhabitants of the White House, and these are the people that attract attention. And the more outrageous they are, the more attention the more followers they seem to attract. And of course, big media is complicit in this arrangement. And we're getting a kind of mob rule. Now, in my place, I try to speak out against that, and all I get in return is death threats and claims that I should be prosecuted and thrown in jail and things like that. Well, you just shrug it off. Canada has not been a particularly good player in this area. Canada developed a heavy water nuclear reactor, which are used quite a few places across the world, and India is building some right now. I'm a big fan of heavy water reactors because they're very safe. If something goes wrong, they don't use enriched uranium. They use natural uranium. And it can only follow its nuclear process in the presence of heavy water. If you remove the heavy water, it stops. The reaction stops. So that makes it very safe. You want to shut the reactor down, just turn a valve and drain the water out. But because of the stigma that's been attached to it, Canada has been shutting that down, which is, I think, is a terrible thing to have done. My view is that nuclear is inevitable, and that's what I tell people. Of course, they claim that windmills will do wonderful things, but I just say, sooner or later, you're going to have to get it. The more you get away from carbon, the sooner you're going to have to go to nuclear. You have no choice. Now, CO2 levels, you mentioned that we're in a near starvation. We are definitely in a starvation level for CO2. If the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere had declined by the same amount that it has increased in the last 70 or 80 years, life on Earth would die. There would be no, plants would dry, the trees would dry up. We're that close to being wiped out. If something was to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere, it would be gone. We would be in bad shape. So the more CO2 you can put out, the better. I'm also, having studied particularly the role of CO2 in the climate of Venus, which is being widely blamed as an example of what happens when CO2 gets out of control. That is an absurdity, because actually the climate on Venus is virtually identical to that of Earth after you adjust for radiation levels, radiation loss levels, and compression by gravitation. And given that they're so close, they're literally within a degree of two of each other. And yet Venus has an atmosphere that's 9,700 parts out of 10,000 carbon dioxide, and the Earth has 4 parts in 10,000 carbon dioxide. And yet they match along right beside each other. So where's this greenhouse effect that CO2 is producing? I don't think it heats it at all, but that's just my opinion. Perhaps I conclude that my jurisdiction, which is British Columbia, was the first state or province in North America to enact a carbon tax, and I think it was politically motivated. The people who enacted it are claiming a great success for it, but we did a calculation. We used their numbers. They claimed that the carbon tax had reduced the consumption of gasoline and diesel, that the drop in gasoline and diesel within the province, which may have had other causes, was due entirely to the carbon tax. So that's an exaggerated claim, but we took them at that. Then we took the claim by the IPCC based on the data from the 1990s that the entire change in the Earth's climate was entirely due to the change in CO2 levels in the atmosphere, which was something like a doubling would lead to a 3-degree change in climate. So these are using maximized exaggerated numbers. We then applied the amount of CO2 used, the amount of human source CO2 that comes out of British Columbia, and then we matched that to these numbers, multiplied them through, and using their numbers and their claims, the carbon tax in BC affected the climate by 5 millionths of a degree. Now, BC uses production of CO2, man-made CO2, is about 1,000th of the global level. So if you multiply that number by 5, you end up with a 5,000ths of a degree change caused by a carbon tax, which is immeasurably minuscule. It's nothing. The claim that a carbon tax will save the Earth is complete nonsense. But that's what they're pushing now, along with all the other stuff. I hope that helps you with this discussion here. There's not much else I can say. You guys did such a good job. There's nothing I can add.
Well, let's just see. I'll ask first, Dr. Kem. You have anything?
Jason made a comment about looking after the animals and so on. I'm all in favor of looking after animals. That's now serious environmental concern to do that and to do it properly. For example, here in South Africa, about 10 days ago, there was a press announcement of a rhino technique using nuclear. And it actually went around the world. It was in World Nuclear News. I believe it was maybe on TV in the United States. I've heard that through the grapevine. But what we've done at the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation have developed a technique to put some very low-level radioactive material into the horns of rhinos. Because the rhinos, on a weight basis, a rhino horn is worth more than gold. People are coming in here with automatic rifles, shooting rhinos, cutting with a chainsaw into their faces while the rhino's still alive, cutting its horn out, and they find a rhino lying there still breathing with his face hacked to pieces by a chainsaw so they can get the horn out, and it makes its way through to the Far East, where it is then sold for a huge amount of money. I'm all in favor of allowing rhino horn and elephant ivory to be exported in a professional manner under controlled circumstances, because every one of those animals has to die someday, so they will all produce horn and tusk at their death. But we don't want them killed early on. So this nuclear method has been developed now. There's also what wasn't in the press releases, there's a code built into it. So we can tell from the code that we know where that animal came from in South Africa, whether it was from the east or the north or whatever the case might be. So if a horn is cut off and it's been tagged with this method and is picked up somewhere on the transportation line from here to the Far East or wherever it ends up, we can read the radioactive signature of it and know that A, it's a stolen horn, and B, where it comes from. And now that is something that has been pioneered by South Africans, and we don't find massive support coming from the likes of Greenpeace and a lot of these green organizations. When it really comes to saving elephants and rhinos, and sadly, here you'll find that there's 1 or 2 or 3 rhinos shot every single day. There's an absolute rhino war going on at the moment. The South African side, the game guards patrolling in the bush, but it's huge, and our game conservation areas are very large. Hundreds of kilometers from one side to another. It's not a little park that you can put a fence around. And so it's a large operation. There's helicopters flying around. We have even certain military units have been used to go and hunt these people down and so on. But what do we see? We see a huge fuss being made of CO2 from industrial carbon dioxide emissions and so on and so forth. There's all big hoo-ha. Stop building motor cars, stop doing this because of the planet. But nobody's coming out to help the world with where all the rhinos in the world are in Africa, the elephants and other animals that are being stolen, and plants, by the way. There's some very rare plants here in South Africa. The international syndicates that are coming in and stealing the rare plants, it's a huge operation. But we fight all this sort of thing ourselves alone or with minimal support from others. There isn't a big worldwide green reaction against the slaughter of animals, the theft of plants, and all sorts of other damaging things. They've got all the energy in the world to worry about industrial CO2. There's just something wrong about that.
Jason, did you have anything that you wanted to say in response to Mr. Fell? If not, I'll go to Diane.
No, not in particular. I mean, I enjoyed the comment that we're being run by technological morons. I think that's accurate, and the kind of sense of humor you need when talking about this whole crazy subject.
I know that Diane has a couple of questions that have been sent to her, so I'm going to go there. And I've got a question for Mr. Fell about his father and a book I happen to have on my shelf, which I read all the time, America BC. But we'll come back to that. You start, Diane.
Okay. Well, this is a question for Jason from Kynan. He writes, in your presentation, you talked about the models used in the past to project the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. And I've also seen several models calculating the rise of the sea level, mainly those used by Tom Weissmuller in past town hall meetings. All of these models are wrong, as you have shown. Why is that? What is the problem with relying on computer models to determine climate change or even other things like future economic growth? Is it possible to improve upon these models?
Well, I guess there's two aspects to that kind of. One is whether the models are meant to be honest in the first place. I mean, sometimes, you say, okay, look, we've got a policy objective. Let's get someone to make a model that presents something that looks like data that supports what we want to do anyway. And then that gives us, a veneer of, of scientific respectability. Look, we hired some science person and they used a computer and they used a model and it was all very complicated. And then this came out in the end. Therefore, we should go ahead and, and do this thing that we wanted to do anyway. Partly, they know that they're lying. That's one reason the models are wrong. They intend to have a certain outcome, not in order to learn the truth, but to achieve a policy that they want for other reasons. That is, the policy isn't coming from the modeling, right? The modeling is helping to provide a justification for a policy that they want anyway. Here's a couple quotes on this. So, 1975, Margaret Mead, a horrible woman, also part of this environmentalist stuff, she said, "What we need from scientists are estimates presented with sufficient conservatism and plausibility, but at the same time as free as possible from internal disagreements that can be exploited by political interests, that will allow us to start building a system of artificial but effective warnings which will parallel the instincts of animals who flee before the hurricane." Another speaker at her 1975 conference on the atmosphere, Stephen Schneider, said, "To capture the public imagination, we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and little mention of any doubts one might have. Each of us has to decide the right balance between being effective and being honest." So that's one of the things that's wrong with these models, not honest. Okay, the other thing is that if you're trying to understand a complex process and you simply don't actually know what governs it, then you're going to be wrong. So, I can make a model about, to try to predict what, my cat's going to, I don't have a cat, but what my neighbor's cat is going to do. And, and maybe it's sort of accurate some of the time. Unless you actually fully understand a cat, which nobody does, you're not going to figure out everything this cat's going to do. You simply don't understand the process. Now, the Earth as a whole, that's pretty complex, isn't it? So in terms of the sea level rise things, where people were predicting, rises of sea level by, yards, by meters, and they made these predictions long enough ago that they should have come to fruition by today, they were way off. And I think those are the two reasons. One, lying. Two, to the extent people weren't lying or looking forward to having a result that they really wanted to achieve, they simply made models that weren't up to the task. So if you think about economics, that's part of this global warming stuff, climate change stuff right now, is that there's so many parts to this, right? Does CO2 impact the climate? Okay. Yes or no? Maybe it's a yes or no question, but the real thing is how much? Okay, so that's a more complex question. In what ways? Even more complex. And then you say, well, what should our response be? What's the cost of reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we emit versus what's the cost of saying, oh, the water increased by a centimeter. What do we have to do to deal with that? And then actually weighing them. That requires economic models, which get even more complicated, and no one knows really what they're doing with these things. So that's part of the issue, where this certainty is presented, when really these conclusions rely on so many steps, each of which you could bombard with hundreds of questions about whether they're accurate or not. And that's simply part of the issue. One of the other issues with trying to model economy is that you don't know when a scientific breakthrough is going to happen. So you can say, this is how I think things will occur, but then what happens if there's a huge breakthrough in nuclear fusion? You will have been really wrong, and you couldn't have known in advance when that breakthrough would occur.
Okay, so I'm just going to bogart in this case. I just want to, because there was an actual discussion, Jason, you referenced this idea about how that people have to be responsible for actually beginning to think scientifically, and that it ought to be something which is natural to the human being. In fact, it can be said that the very idea of inquiry, especially if you're being confronted by your supposed responsibility to suddenly make policy for the planet, minimally, it might be a good idea to get an idea how you even inquire into a topic of some importance and controversy. And I just wanted to reference this. I don't know if people have ever seen this. This is America BC. It is a book which was written by Barry Fell, Julian's father. And it's a book which became famous because, well, as it indicates in a little part of what's on the back, with illuminating texts and pictures, Mr. Fell describes ancient European temple inscriptions from New England and the Midwest that date as far back as 800 BC. And some of us have talked about the trip or the voyage of Captain Maui to the New World from Libya, present-day Libya, over to Irian Jaya, and then later on to the western coast of the United States. Just like if you could tell us a little bit about your father, but about also just the way in which he became interested in an area which was new, and how that hypothesis was formed. I realize this is off the apparent topic of climate change, but it's on the topic of the idea of real scientific work leading to a breakthrough that nobody foresees.
Or a lot of people still refuse to believe. Yeah, my dad had multiple interests. He was very successful scientifically in a number of endeavors, which seriously upset other people in these fields, because if you're a biologist, he was basically a biologist. If you make breakthroughs in linguistics and geology, the linguists and geologists don't welcome your presence. One of his hobbies was ancient Mediterranean languages. He had a love for ancient Greece. He had Homer committed to memory, but he also had an interest. He was studying the movement of animals passively across ocean currents, because he was trying to detect the presence of the orientation of the planet in the past, particularly prior to what was claimed to be continental drift. His view was that simply that animals that follow passive climate belts will show in the fossils that there are belts that travel around the world according to the climate, and that if continents have moved around, all you have to do is track these fossils of these passive animals, and that will tell you where they sat on the planet in the past. And what he discovered there was that very little change had happened. In fact, for the most part, continental drift probably had not occurred as recently as claimed, because the fossils did not support that. That got him blacklisted by the geologists, I can tell you. So he tried to see if languages followed similar patterns, because and that led him to Polynesia. He knew a lot about Polynesia because he had grown up in New Zealand. And in doing that, he realized that there were words in the Polynesian language that had Indo-European origin. That was a surprise, because that was not expected. It turned out that Humboldt, the explorer's brother, and another famous linguist of Polynesians from about 100 years ago, had also made the same realizations, but that had not been published or had been suppressed. So following that, he started looking at inscriptions, and he's very good at deciphering. And so he started publishing on the presence of these inscriptions in Polynesia, which tended to point to linguistically having a Mediterranean or an Indian origin. And when he was doing that, a whole lot of people, archaeologists from North America, came to him and said, well, we understand you were pretty good with these inscriptions. Would you take a look at these ones that I've found that I can't explain? And when Barry looked at it, he realized that these were ancient European inscriptions, mostly Mediterranean, but some from Northern America also. And this clearly pointed to visitation to North America by explorers long before Columbus. In other words, Columbus wasn't first, he was the last. And it sort of took off from that. That was so he wrote a book on it, which was very popular for a short time, and that's the book you have there, America BC. That was basically how it came about.
Okay. Yeah. So I just would like maybe some people have to comment because we're going to begin to wind down now or soon. But about this idea of inquiry and the fact that you may discover something that upsets the field of science as it had been previously uh, uh, thought to be organized. But having the idea that some of the citizens ought to, conversely, bother to try to think scientifically before accepting many of these sort of uh, faddish ideas that are put forward, whether it's about global warming or it's about other things. So maybe what we could do, well, Diane, is there anything you'd have to say at this point before we move into our final phase?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Okay, great. So, Dr. Kem, I'm going to come back to you and then to Jason, and then I think we'll summarize. So, you have anything in response to what not just to what we've just discussed, but about, oh, I meant to ask you, I'm sorry, really, I'm glad I just remembered it, where John Shanahan described the letter and he described the campaign and he described the idea of trying to get signatures and so forth. Now we're going to be having a conference, and that'll be in 3 weeks. And the title for one of the panels, if I can bring it up here, is "The True Science Behind Climate Change: Why the World Needs 7 Terawatts of Energy." I knew that's what. Yeah, I wanted to make sure I asked you. The real science behind climate change: Why the world needs 7 terawatts of energy. So that's going to be in 3 weeks. We hope you can join us for that. But why would the world need that much energy, and who's going to be using it?
Oh, I think there's no doubt that that amount of energy will be used because the amount of electricity is increasing, like I said earlier on. It's increasing dramatically. There are people now with cell phones. I mean, the amount of cell phone text traffic that's going around now. Elon Musk has been launching satellites, a huge constellation of satellites. Will there be some thousands of satellites to increase the speed of internet traffic? The Starlink series. This type of thing is going to cause more and more electricity to be used continuously. People are going to each be using much more, and there are also many people who don't use any electricity now who will be entering the market. There's more and more automated methods. So to imagine that there's going to be continuous economic growth, a continuous improvement in the welfare of people on the basis of limiting electricity growth is just not feasible. And it's going to increase dramatically. So I don't for one moment think there isn't going to be a vast amount of electricity used in the future in comparison to now. Just like we look back now, a mere 25 to 30 years, and the world was using half the power of now. We can't conceive of 50% of our electricity disappearing, say, tomorrow morning. It just feels impossible. But the planet was operating on 50% less a mere 25 to 30 years ago. So it's undoubtedly going to all over to everybody. Everybody will be benefiting. Every time some factory uses more electricity to be more efficient, faster, and whatever, the consumers on the street benefit. So it's to the benefit of everybody. There'll be many more new electrical devices that will come about.
Jason?
As far as wrapping up overall, I definitely agree that it's going to be easy to use 7 terawatts of power in the world. Just a couple of reflections on the discussion overall is, how important it is to be able to have freely discussions on difficult topics, and that's something that's not easy for a number of reasons right now. I mean, one is, that people hold strong opinions at times without really knowing why they hold them, and pulling that out of them or helping people realize that they maybe don't actually have a reason to hold the opinions that they do, makes people uncomfortable. People don't like thinking about that sometimes. People don't like to be challenged, especially if you're, trying to, get at them personally while you're doing that. So it can be very difficult sometimes to separate out trying to figure out what's true from your perception of somebody as a human being. It's a difficult discussion process, but I think that one of the really important ways to make that more possible as a society, I'll come back to this issue of education, and we're not going to fix education with charter schools that end up sort of cherry picking who they allow in to boost their numbers. People have sort of these fantastic notions about how a few small changes are going to transform education, and the teachers and the few hours a day they spend with children are going to transform society in a huge way. I think we've got to act on a larger level than that, which is that if we are committed to enormous projects like the realization of nuclear fusion, to the colonization, at least to some degree, of the moon, sending scientists to Mars on nuclear rockets, not chemical, death traps, chemically powered rocket death traps, then the kinds of demands that this is going to make on society overall will help to organize what's required in terms of people's ability to think. And I think that you really can't separate out these issues. The space program created a huge increase in people studying science and engineering. I think similarly, having a real science driver program for today, not climate modeling, but solving these real issues, this could play a very, I think, important role in improving over the medium or longer term, the quality of discussion that we're able to engage in.
Okay, Diane, I'm going to go to you to say something about our conference, which will be happening in the next 3 weeks, I guess on June 26th, 27th, along with any other remarks you have.
Well, I was thinking about the conference, and actually I think we have to think of it as a movement. We've talked about a worldwide anti-Malthusian resistance, and that's exactly what we're going to be pulling together over these 2 days. I believe it's going to start at 9 o'clock in the morning on Saturday the 26th, and the same time on Sunday the 27th. There'll be 2 panels each day to allow for participation across many time regions. There won't be panels going late into the evening. The first panel is on the question of the strategic situation where we have a very real war danger. If people remember, the prelude to the Iraq War after 9/11 was that none other than Sir Richard Dearlove and British intelligence told us that they had absolutely irrefutable evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. We had to get over there and destroy them. And of course, it turned out to be a total lie, but we killed perhaps over 1 million Iraqis, and over 5,000 Americans have died there. We're hearing things now about China. Richard Dearlove has taken it upon himself to assert that he knows absolutely where the virus originates from, but that surely the Chinese will have destroyed all the evidence. That's the nice thing. They never have to prove anything. And similar things about Russia. We heard that Russia meddling in the election was tantamount to 9/11. Now there's other things that are tantamount to 9/11. I mean, it's really something. So this is very urgent. The other topics we had today as sort of a prelude for the science panel, which will be a discussion not only of the fraud of climate change and global warming, but the potential represented by scientific breakthroughs in the fields of fusion, space exploration, how the universe actually works and can develop. There will be a discussion of this, another panel on the hyperinflation that we are experiencing, the blowout. Everyone who is not some criminal billionaire, which I hope is most of you listening, perhaps all of you listening are not criminal billionaires, may have noticed that the price of basic commodities is skyrocketing, and generally your income is not. So certain measures, LaRouche's 4 laws, starting with Glass-Steagall, have to be implemented. And then finally, or not finally, I should say, a panel on the only actual method of scientific thought on the question of Nicholas of Cusa's coincidence of opposites. And we had quite a lengthy discussion about this morning, and it is a complex idea. But I think the effort to work through this complexity in many areas, in music, in poetry, in science, in the work that we are doing to demonstrate that it is not necessary for millions of more people to die of pandemic disease or starvation or from war, but you have to take a different approach to thinking. So the point of this conference is to pull together those forces internationally who wish to move the entire planet and man's role in the solar system to a new paradigm, a new level of operating. And I would urge everybody to go to schillerinstitute.com to register yourself for this conference immediately, to make sure that you clear the weekend of June 26th and 27th to participate in that.
All right, so Julian Fell, Dr. Calvin Kem, Jason Ross, and Diane Say, I want to thank you for being with us today. I want to thank everybody for listening. I want to invite everybody to get involved with that, organizing for that conference. Also, you will be able to find more information about what's going on with the campaign against craziness in science being conducted by Dr. Kem and his friends and our organization and our basement team. So that's something we'd ask you all to be involved with. That will be 3 weeks from now. There'll be a Schiller Institute conference, 2 days, June 26th and 27th. So that concludes today's Manhattan Town Meeting of the LaRouche Organization for June 5th. I'm Dennis Speed. We'll see you next week.